It was late afternoon when Emily decided to go for a hike. The sun hovered low over the dense trees, casting an orange glow across the narrow dirt trail. She had hiked these woods countless times before, but today there was something different. The birds were quiet. The air, usually filled with the buzzing of insects and soft rustling of leaves, was strangely still. Ignoring the prickle of unease, Emily pushed forward, breathing in the earthy scent of the forest. As she walked, the silence grew oppressive. Each step she took echoed back to her, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. She was about halfway up the trail when she noticed something strange lying on the ground, a shiny silver whistle. It looked new, completely out of place in the wilderness. She picked it up, examining the odd scratches on its surface. 3 short scratches on one side, 4 long on the other, almost like tally marks. Frowning, she slid the whistle into her pocket and continued on. The trail wound up a steep incline, and as Emily climbed, she felt eyes on her. She glanced over her shoulder, seeing nothing but twisted tree trunks and deep shadows. Just as she turned to continue, she heard a snap of twig breaking somewhere behind her. Her heart hammered. She stopped, listening, straining to catch any sound, but everything was silent once more. Shaking off the feeling, she quickened her pace. But as she rounded a bend, she found herself face to face with something horrifying. Draped over a bush at the side of the trail was a muddy, torn piece of fabric, a pale blue, like her own jacket. She touched it hesitantly, and a sinking feeling twisted in her stomach. It was damp, and as she drew her hand back, she realized it was stained with something dark. Just then, the silence was shattered by a distant, low whistle. It was the same eerie 3-note melody, repeating itself over and over. The sound sent a chill down her spine. She knew there was no one else on this trail. She'd checked the parking lot when she arrived, and hers was the only car. As she walked faster, almost jogging now, the whistle grew louder, closer. She glanced back and saw something flash between the trees, a shadow, too big to be an animal. She forced herself to keep moving, but her pace quickened. The whistling followed her, matching her stride, echoing through the trees like a taunt. She reached into her pocket, gripping the whistle she'd found earlier, hoping that somehow it might help. But as she touched it, she felt a strange vibration against her palm, as if the whistle itself was alive. She nearly dropped it, but something made her hold on tighter. The path suddenly split. One way led back down to the parking lot, and the other wound deeper into the forest, up toward the ridge. She hesitated, feeling that dread rise urging her to go back. But as she looked down the trail, she spotted a figure standing in the distance. A man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by shadows. He was too far away for her to make out any details, but his stance was unmistakable. He was waiting. Without thinking, she turned and sprinted up the ridge trail, her legs burning as she pushed herself forward. The whistling continued, louder now, like it was coming from all directions. It played tricks on her mind, seeming to get closer then farther away, but always there. She glanced back only once, and her blood went cold. The man was following her, moving through the trees with an unnatural speed and silence. Her lungs burned as she reached the top of the ridge. The forest opened up, and she could see the valley stretching out before her, dark and endless. She turned, realizing she was trapped. The only way back was the trail she'd come up, and the shadowy figure was getting closer. In a surge of desperation, She raised the whistle to her lips and blew as hard as she could. Nothing happened. The whistle made no sound, as if the air itself refused to acknowledge her. She tried again and again, but each time it was met with silence. But then she heard a soft rustling behind her. She turned, hoping for help, but froze. Standing in the shadows of the trees were figures, pale, ghostly, almost translucent, their faces blank, eyes hollow and staring. She recognized one of them instantly. It was her friend, Sarah, who had disappeared on a hike 2 years ago in these very woods. One by one, the figures stepped forward, whispering her name in unison. Emily! A scream clawed its way up her throat as she backed away, only to find the man now blocking her path. His face was still obscured, but he tilted his head as if studying her, and she felt his gaze pierce right through her. Desperate, she blew the whistle once more, and this time it let out a faint, eerie tone. The sound echoed through the woods, and as it faded, the ghostly figures surrounded her, reaching out with cold, ethereal hands. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the man's face as he smiled, a cruel, twisted grin that promised she would join the other spirits in the woods. Days later, a search party found her backpack on the trail, but no sign of Emily was ever discovered. Just a lone whistle, scratched with strange marks, lying on the forest floor. To this day, hikers report hearing faint whistling in those woods, especially as the sun begins to set. And those brave enough to follow it always find the same thing, a whistle lying on the ground, waiting for the next soul to claim.